so I hope that my voice will last me all of the presentation. But I thought actually I'd start this lecture in a dramatic way and jump straight into the issue at hand. So there's overwhelming evidence that climate change is real, and since the 1950s, scientists have noticed an increase in the number of extreme events, like heat waves, very high sea levels, and heavy rains leading to floods. And cities face particular challenges, not only because the concentration of people and assets in these areas, but also because urbanization drives hazards. For instance, materials like concrete and asphalt prevent floodwater from filtering into the ground, and they also store heat, so probably you've all heard of the urban heat island effect. So there's this increasing consensus that cities need to adapt to handle the dangerous effects of climate change, a process also known as climate change adaptation. And we also know that poor and vulnerable and informal communities are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And they are in no way a trivial or marginal part of cities. By 2050, 3 billion people worldwide will be living in informal areas of favelas. And in a recent publication in the journal Nature, studying informal settlements was named one of the 6 most urgent priorities and gaps for urban adaptation research. To develop relevant tools and models for these areas. And one of the adaptation options that's gained a lot of policy interest in Brazil and worldwide is ecosystem-based adaptation. And I see that a lot of you already are familiar with the concepts, so it's humbling to be in a room full of experts. But if someone is not, it's a method that uses nature and ecosystems to help people face the dangerous aspects of climate risk. For instance, you can use green roofs to reduce indoor temperature, or restoring mountain vegetation to reduce landslide risk, or mangroves to deal with storm surges. But there are still important knowledge gaps regarding how it can be implemented in urban areas. And when these policy reports talk about people's participation or local ecological knowledge, they tend to refer to traditional communities or indigenous groups, and not to urban citizens who are vulnerable to climate change, but they might also have local ecological knowledge. And this is not only a problem for EBA, but in fact a lot of urban adaptation research globally has been conducted in separation from existing knowledge in urban planning and critical urban theory. So this is a call to all urban and critical geographers out there to kind of occupy adaptation research. So my research project, my new research project, focuses on EBA, and the question I'd like to pose today here is, how can favelas be adapted to deal with floods, landslides, and heat waves, and water scarcity? Of course, taking into the account the reality of living there, because adaptation doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It happens in the middle of rested life. And in addition to reduce risk, we need to know what people care about, because risk is related to values. So for me, adapting favelas need to happen with and for their residents, and without, for that sake, transferring all the responsibility for adaptation to the individual. And second, it seems to me that EBA in the favelas should consider the diverse ways that favela residents interact with nature and biodiversity. And here we get into another interesting research gap. There's very important research going on about the people's risk perception, for instance. But what about the perception of nature and local ecological knowledge of favela dwellers? So, unfortunately, I will not answer all of these questions today, because this is something that I will be working on for the next 3 years. But with this lecture, I hope to share some of the theory that I draw on, so we can frame the problem. So the rest of this lecture will be organized something like this. I will give a brief introduction to who I am and my journey to the scientific discipline where I find myself now, sustainability science. And then I want to give you a theoretical toolbox on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, how I see it, and most of the lecture will be focused here. And then I'll tell you a bit about my previous research on ecosystem-based adaptation and climate change adaptation. And then I will introduce my new and exciting project, and I also hope that we can have a discussion together what it means to adapt favelas to climate change. So, who am I? I am a postdoc from Luxus, Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies in Sweden. And the next 3 years I will have the luxury to divide my time between Lund and Rio de Janeiro, where I'm a visiting postdoc fellow at EES and UFRJ. And this is all part of my postdoc project on urban ecosystem-based adaptation. And I completed my PhD in sustainability science in 2018, and it was on adaptation in Swedish coastal municipalities. But my background is from a completely different field, actually. It's engineering, mathematics, and risk management, which you kind of wouldn't imagine if you look at the kind of research that I'm doing today, which I would call kind of interdisciplinary social science. So I've come a long way from mathematics in my scientific trajectory. And nowadays, the main focus of my research is on the social dimensions of urban risk and urban nature. So I draw on theories and methods from different disciplines, and sometimes I also do research together with stakeholders, like municipal planners, which you can call transdisciplinary research. And this thing with researchers working for and with society, I know you're very good at that here in Brazil because you have this thing called extensão. And Rio de Janeiro actually has a special role in my journey from the technical sciences to sustainability science. Because I came here in 2010 to collect data for my master's thesis in the area of risk management, which was supposed to be a quantitative examination of the relation between people's level of disaster risk and their level of education in the community of Rocinha, which you see here. So I arrived in Rocinha as a volunteer English teacher, living in the community, and I happened to be there at the time of a tragic landslide that killed 2 women in virou, that's this high part of Rocinha. And this started a whole process of the municipality trying to relocate the people living there, but many residents were suspicious and they didn't want to move. So I ended up finding all these social science aspects of disaster much more fascinating. Like, who is at risk and why do people fight to stay in these risk areas? Not only in Brazil, I might mention, but this is also a topic in my Swedish municipalities. So I ended up living in Rocinha for almost 2 years. Oh, and here are some pictures that I took after the landslide in Rocinha. And at this time, I also became aware of the fact that favela residents were often portrayed as passive, but actually you could see these small-scale and everyday adaptations all the time, like people having extra high thresholds to keep flood water from entering their houses, or cleaning the drains to prevent floods, or using plants in different ways. And also there's this complex system with pumps and water tanks to mitigate the effects of frequent water stoppages. Okay, so now you already told me that most of you come from geography, right? So I think I'll skip this first thing, but I would still like to ask and get to know a little bit better. Who here has worked with the concept of climate adaptation? Raise your hand.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
Who has worked with the concept of climate change adaptation? Yes?
Well, already a question actually, because we are now working on a project that is about nature-based solution
Yes, yeah, I will get to that also to talk about the difference.
Yeah, about the difference. So I don't know if that is
It
directly
might-
associated with climate change adaptation. I
It
think
might be,
is.
but not always.
Yes,
I would say
yeah.
nature-based solution is a broader concept.
Okay.
What about ecosystem services? Who's familiar with ecosystem services? That's most of you, I think. And ecosystem-based adaptation. Yeah, a few people. Who works with the concept of risk? And what about vulnerability? That's also most of you.
Don't they go together?
Yeah, they do go together.
For me, it's so hard to separate them. You know, sometimes I'm reading or writing something and it's difficult to separate because they are all together.
Yeah, and they're actually differently defined in different areas. So in adaptation, there's one definition of vulnerability, and in disasters reduction, there's another definition. Okay, so to step back a little bit from the issue of adaptation in favelas, why sustainability science and what is this discipline about? And as you know, natural scientists have identified these escalating geophysical and biophysical processes that will have deep social impacts. And this includes biodiversity loss, land use change, water scarcity, and climate change. And these challenges are different than some of the old problems, like hunger, disease, and poverty, and things that people have been dealing with for millennia and that have been actually extensively studied. But these new problems, they're communicated to society by the scientists as emerging or future problems that we're really just starting to understand and grapple with. And what's worse is that these new challenges will also interact with the old problems in very complex ways. So for instance, as most of you probably know, that poverty and inequality, they cause some people to be more vulnerable to climate change impacts. And corruption can prevent construction norms for disaster safety from being followed. So we're looking at these kind of interrelated, long-lasting or wicked problems. And it's difficult to find solutions. And in fact, trying to solve the wicked problem often leads to creating new problems. So to address these issues, we need a new kind of science, sustainability science. And it has some particular features. And one of those features is that it's problem-driven. And that means that it departs from these real-life sustainability challenges and tries to find creative solutions to those. But it's also critical, and that means that it doesn't just accept the problems as they first appear, but it also looks at why problems are framed in a certain way and who gains or loses from that. And sustainability science is also naturally interdisciplinary, which means that it uses theories and methods from different academic fields, and finally tries to influence society in a more sustainable direction, which is sometimes referred to as transformational objective. So that's that about sustainability science. So before I start talking about my own research, I wanted to tell you about this theoretical perspective I'm coming from, where I actually combine theory from adaptation, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. So as we saw before, the climate is changing and we are largely to blame. But what about mitigation, someone says? And yes, mitigating climate change is also important. But even if we could radically reduce all our emissions starting from now, it's clear that we also have to adapt our societies to the changes in the climate that are already underway. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it defines adaptation like this: the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects, to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. So why would I highlight actual or expected climate? Well, I think it actually provides the perfect motivation for why we need to combine these two perspectives of adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Because it's not just about what the climate will be like in 50 or 100 years, but actually climate-related disasters are happening today. And well, it reflects the fact that many cities aren't even well adapted to the current climate, as also became clear here in Rio a few weeks ago. This is from Assista. So to keep this theoretical part reasonably short, I've chosen 3 messages that capture my theoretical perspective of climate change adaptation, or actually 4, because I added a bonus one this morning. And the first one is that climate change implies changes in both means and variability. What does that mean? So on one hand, adaptation can be understood as an adjustment to these slow but irreversible changes in the climate, like rising sea levels and global warming. And by the end of this century, mean temperatures might be 2 to 4 degrees higher and sea level 1 meter higher than at the end of the 20th century. But on the other hand, climate change implies also an increased number of extreme events, temporary extremes like floods and storms, temporarily high sea levels, and temperature extremes, which we're already starting to notice. So reducing risk here is more of a cyclical process with different sets of measures that need to be taken before and during and after these events. And the latter has actually been studied for a longer time in a different research field, which is disaster risk reduction. And it's in this more mature field, that has its roots in political ecology, that you find some of the more radical and progressive thinking. So let's take a closer look at these 2 fields. So they started off as separate, but now they're becoming increasingly integrated. So disaster risk reduction is traditionally more event-focused, and it's more focused on historical analysis of disaster events, while climate change adaptation naturally is more future-oriented. It talks about changes over time. And disaster risk reduction has traditionally been more bottom-up. It focuses on working with local actors, NGOs, communities, while climate change adaptation traditionally is more top-down because it comes from climate science. And then, as I said, disaster risk reduction has a longer history, and climate change climate change adaptation is a newer area, and it's more politically sexy. So in some countries, at least, if you want to get funding, it's better to call your initiative adaptation than disaster risk reduction. But then again, there are some countries where they're denying climate change, and then it might actually be more strategic to call it disaster risk reduction. And important organs for DRR is the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Kyoto Framework, while for climate change adaptation, it's the IPCC, the UNFCCC, and the Kyoto Protocol. Well, actually, not for, it's mainly focused on mitigation. But as you may realize, there's quite a big overlap between these 2 fields when it comes to reducing the risk of the kind of disasters that will become more common with climate change, like floods, landslides, heat waves, coastal inundation, and so on. But then, there they are. But not all disasters are climate related. There are also technical disasters or geological ones like earthquakes and volcanoes. And then they fall into DRR. And then there are climate effects which can't really be called disasters, but we still have to adapt to them, like changes in agricultural seasons, or health effects from things like pollen, new disease vectors, etc. And they then fall into CCA. But it's this critical part where these 2 fields overlap, that I focus my work. And importantly, this also includes small scale and kind of everyday disasters, which may have a very large effect over time at eroding capacities in a community. So what can disaster studies, or DRR, contribute to adaptation? Well, in my view, it's a more comprehensive view of risk. So firstly, in disaster risk reduction, disasters or adverse climate impacts of extreme events are products of continuously present conditions of risk. So the risk is always there, even in normal times, and this has implications for how to reduce risk. It means that we should be proactive and try to reduce the underlying components of disaster risk, rather than merely manage hazards or disasters as they occur. And this view is not always so popular with politicians, because it does mean that they're responsible. And secondly, risk includes, a bit simplified, a natural hazard part, and a social vulnerability part. And some also include, in this pseudo-equation, a capacity or preparedness for response and recovery. So let's break this down. Hazards that are expected to increase in a changed climate include floods, landslides, sea level rise, heat waves, and droughts. And in reality, they can't be seen as purely natural hazards, because they might also be amplified or triggered by human activities like land use. And vulnerability then describes the conditions and processes that make people prone to harm from such hazards. And these are often socio-political in nature. So a flood or a storm by itself will never make a disaster unless it meets with these socially produced conditions of vulnerability. And like this, we understand that there's really no such thing as a natural disaster. So no one actually in the field would use this term, natural disaster. And DRR also emphasizes that vulnerability is contextual. So what makes people vulnerable in one situation or to one hazard doesn't necessarily make them vulnerable to another. And an example of this from Sweden, it's that elderly people are often seen as more vulnerable. But there was a storm that hit Sweden in 2004. It was called the Gudrun. And it left a large part of the countryside without electricity and other services, and actually all the wood, the forest, just, you couldn't get anywhere for days, and somewhere for weeks. So what they found was that old people were generally better equipped to handle this isolation, since they have lived through other storms and they had kept old features of their house intact, like wood stoves and wells. So vulnerability is contextual. And a simplified example of how you could apply this framework or way of thinking to the community of Hosnia. So we have the hazard part. And hazards like floods and landslides, they are amplified by improper land use, deforestation, and extensive littering of the slopes, and sewer canals, which destabilizes the slopes and blocks the sewers. And then we have aspects that increase vulnerability, is that many houses have substandard structures with too many floors, lacking sanitation increases the risk that floodwater carries diseases like leptospirosis, and also, of course, the thick urban fabric means that there's a lack of ventilation, so hot days feel even hotter. And low income might mean that people have little money to invest in measures to reduce the vulnerability of their houses. And then when you talk about a response preparedness, or what could reduce the preparedness for response, for instance, the narrow streets means that emergency vehicles can't enter. And recovery preparedness, for instance, that people are less likely to have insurance or savings to build back their houses if they suffer a disaster. So these are the components that some people see as capacity, but you could also see them as part of vulnerability. It's a little bit different. way of understanding risk and vulnerability comes from the milestone book At Risk by Ben Wissner et al. From 2004. And here you see again how risk emerges from the interaction between hazards and vulnerability. So hazards are here on the right, and here is the vulnerability. But here instead they break up vulnerability into factors that are more or less close in space and time. So from the immediate unsafe conditions, like dangerous locations, for instance, to intermediate dynamic pressures like rapid urbanization or declining biodiversity, to actually more abstract root causes like power structures or political ideologies. And the model is called pressure and release, PAR, because the idea is that seeing beyond the immediate triggers of disasters, you're better equipped to work towards releasing these pressures that are driving the risk. And here, I don't think you can read because the text is very small, but it's an example of the pressure and release model being applied to the tragedy in the Região Serrana. It's from a publication from 2017, which is actually a collaboration between a Brazilian disaster scholar, Victor Marchesini, and Ben Wissner, who was one of the authors of this framework from the last slide. And it's worth to check out this source. I think it's all online, and different chapters are in English or Portuguese or Spanish. So that's a good source for disaster studies. So, okay, this was the longest one. They're not all this long. But after this, we can add to the message. Climate risk means that increasing climate-induced hazards will interact with existing socio-politically produced vulnerabilities. In other words, things like increased temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns, and water scarcity will interact with housing shortages, lack of urban planning, or quotas for water delivery in favelas. And it's not possible to say that this was a climate change disaster or this was a regular disaster, because they're always intertwined. So, third, a successful climate change adaptation strategy uses a combination of diverse approaches to address the technical, economic, institutional, ecological, and social drivers of risk. And what do I mean with that? Sorry. So there are different ways of categorizing measures for climate change adaptation. But one of them is this simple typology of fiscal, economic, institutional, ecosystem-based, or social measures. And if you put them in this order, it also follows quite nicely how the adaptation debate has evolved over time. So here we have the physical, yes, and then the economic, around 2006, when the Stern review of climate change came out, talking about the economic loss related to climate change. Oops, sorry. And then we have the institutional kind of governance turn around 2010. And then ecosystem-based approaches, drawing on ecosystems and their capacity to regulate temperatures and provide shade, etc. And this literature has virtually exploded in the last years. And then also the social approaches, measures that try to engage citizens, like awareness campaigns, early warning, which is actually basic DRR measures. And I also must say that this order maybe is not representative for the global south, because in some resource scarce contexts, the focus has always been here, or a lot of the focus at least. And now the global north has a lot to learn from these kind of community-based approaches to risk reduction. But my main argument with this slide is that you can't just do one of these. In order to have a comprehensive adaptation strategy, you need to put all of these to work so that you have a flexible system where if one thing fails, there's another one that works. Make sense? And this is also reflected in the definition of EBA, or ecosystem-based adaptation, as the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of an overall adaptation strategy to help people adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. And for instance, then by managing, conserving, and restoring ecosystems. Yes. And then we get to the bonus one that I added this morning, and that is the fact that adaptation will have winners and losers. So compared to climate change mitigation, which, well, despite all the controversies, it has the kind of clear goal of reducing CO2 emissions. In adaptation, it's much more difficult and complex to measure success, or even to define it. And it becomes maybe only evident in hindsight, or looking at larger periods of time. And we know that there might be trade-offs between adaptation measures for different hazards. Like one example could be that building your house on stilts might be good for flood protection, but it might be less good for, or it might make the house more vulnerable to land movement. And a measure that's effective at the individual level might actually increase the risk for your neighbor, or at the district or city level. So not every adaptation measure is a good one. There are more or less efficient measures, and then those really bad measures that hinder sustainable development or reduce the possibility for others to adapt, now or in the future, they are generally referred to as maladaptation. And then adaptation processes are also marked by this legacy of historical development. They usually try to protect and uphold current structures in society, which sometimes means that they're serving elites in the status quo. And this is increasingly reflected in these two emerging subfields of adaptation: politics of adaptation and critical adaptation, which look at the reproduction of power and conflicts over urban land in adaptation. So that's very exciting. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about my own research, and we're getting close to the end. So my PhD thesis, it was on climate change adaptation in Swedish municipalities. So what happens in Sweden is that the standard way of dealing with hazards like flood, like in much of Europe also, has been this kind of expert-driven engineering approach, trying to keep hazards out or control them using technical, hard structures. And while this is of course a central element in dealing with urban risk, responding to climate change by doing more of that and only that, it's proving very costly and also inflexible. So different new approaches are advocated as a complement, and in my thesis I examined two of these. So one was ecosystem-based adaptation, but scholars are also arguing for increased citizen engagement in adaptation, both because governments have limited capacity and because participation is argued to lead to more suitable and more equitable adaptation policies. So my focus was on coastal municipalities in the south of Sweden. Here you see them. Sweden is very long, so this is just the very south of Sweden. And these municipalities were subjected to sea level rise, fluvial flooding, and heat waves. So the aim of my thesis was to understand how ecosystem-based adaptation and citizen engagement have contributed to reducing risk from adverse climate events at the local level. And in particular, I focused on this: how, on which basis they're implemented, and what are the implications for local governments. And as commonly happens with PhDs, the process was a little bit all over the place, but there were these two threads, at least, throughout the work, and one was EBA and the other one was citizen engagement. And my first PhD paper is a systematic review, where we looked at case studies of urban EBA from across the globe to find out what vocabulary they use, what climate hazards and ecosystems they deal with, and what actors are engaged. And we use methods like document analysis, descriptive statistics, and graphs. And after this, I reduced the scope to the south of Sweden, and I was part of a large research project about ecosystem-based planning, together with other researchers and staff from 7 municipalities in southern Sweden. Here is this happy bunch. And from the regular meetings with them, it gave me an insight into how they plan for EBA, what are some of the drivers and benefits, as well as the problems. And in this paper, I also analyzed the whole transdisciplinary process that we had in this project. So what about the citizens? Well, since their engagement often seemed related to what municipalities were doing, my third paper focused on interactions between the two actors in dealing with climate-related hazard. So I mapped and analyzed 17 such interactions across 3 of the municipalities to find out how citizen engagement looks like in practice. So how did the different actors experience them, and did they seem to have any effect in terms of reducing risk? And finally, I also wanted to get the perspective of people who were not necessarily active in adaptation. So I decided to do a quantitative survey in a coastal neighborhood at risk for floods and storms to understand people's motivation for engaging or not engaging in adaptation activities. So what were their conclusions? Well, examples of EBA, the examples of EBA and citizen engagement that I found, they were not really part of a conscious adaptation strategy from these municipalities, but they had occurred more like haphazardly, and sometimes with other goals in mind, like conservation or stormwater management. So they provide interesting experiences and insights into adaptation, but they also reveal problems, like there is a lack of strategic approach based on risk and vulnerability analysis to decide, for instance, where an EBA gets implemented and who gets selected for participation in these projects. So for instance, in the Swedish municipalities, a lot of EBAs have been implemented kind of ad hoc and through different collaborations or through fixing damages from past hazards. And one civil servant said, things happen and we fix them all around the coast, and now we have to spend a lot of money to do it all over again. And this kind of lack of strategic and long-term climate risk perspective was also evident from the international review. So for instance, less than 15% of all the case studies, of all the papers we reviewed, used any projections or scenarios of future climate conditions. And while I'm talking about this paper, there were also other gaps that the study revealed. That was actually what made me want to study EBA favela in the first place. So there was very little consideration of how benefits are distributed between different socioeconomical groups, and especially regarding vulnerable or marginal or informal areas. And if you look at this, let's see. Most of the cases that we found are from the global north, so there were few case studies from cities in the global south. And luckily, since then, this was published in 2016, a lot of people have done a lot of work on this. But also there was a lack of kind of reflection on how to combine knowledge from different fields to build this EBA science. So when you study something from a long time, you start having like also these annoyances with that topic. And I will just tell you 3 of my annoyances with the EBA discourse. And one of these I call the greener the better. And this is maybe good as a general rule, but in science we have to be more specific than that, right? So if you're managing for EBA, you need specific information about which plant species help secure slopes and prevent landslide, or which shape of the park has the best cooling effect for surrounding neighborhoods. And this way of managing it might be very different than managing for, say, biodiversity. And here we see the main difference between EBA and kind of the wider concept of MBS, because EBA is about managing for hazard reduction. So landslides or floods or heat or some green areas can address multiple hazards, of course. And that's also why I prefer the term ecosystem-based adaptation to nature-based solutions when we're talking about adaptation, because this term actually reminds us that we have to look at future climate projections, we have to look at spatial distribution of risk and vulnerability when we plan for these solutions, or EBAs. And another thing that bugs me about the EBA discourse is when people make these generalizing statements about EBA, that it helps poverty alleviation, it helps with income generation, and justice and empowerment of poor communities. But I doubt that this happens automatically. So I want to know in what ways and under what conditions is EBA just and empowering and all of this. And I think also we need to keep in mind that there is this opposed trend. So it's been observed all over the world that greening the city often means displacing poor people, either by force or because it leads to a valorization of that area of land and increases rent beyond what people can afford. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And another thing that annoys me, and that I saw all the time in the Swedish context, it's talking about EBA only as projects. But there's no use in having a few great or even world-famous EBA projects in your city unless this EBA thinking permeates all of urban planning. And actually Rio de Janeiro has a beautiful climate adaptation plan where exactly this goal to integrate climate and EBA, the climate and EBA lens in all planning and management. So that's very good. But it's not enough to have a vision, as I saw from my studies in the Swedish municipalities. And one of the reasons for that in the Swedish case was this strong pressure for housing development in all of the municipalities. So even when local governments has created instruments to make developers preserve or compensate for green structures, the Swedish national legislation was not strong enough for them to put such pressure on the developers, and there could be very little green left in the end, so maybe a single tree. Oh, and here's also, I've cut some things from the Rio de Janeiro climate adaptation plans. And here are, how many are they? 6 eixos estratégicos. And these are the ones that to me are related to EBA. And these are the kinds of hazards that Rio de Janeiro is planning for. So it's sea level rise, landslides, heat, flooding, and drought. So after my PhD, I was very tired of Swedish coastal municipalities, and I had the luxury of being able to participate in this project called virou, or Building Inclusive Urban Communities. And we were working together with Indian planning and architecture schools to kind of help them raise capacity about how to address these complex challenges of informal settlements, environmental risks, and social exclusion. So it was collaboration between different Indian planning schools, and then also we were representing, me and my supervisor representing risk and adaptation perspective. And in return, I learned a lot about how adaptation interacts with different aspects of urban planning and urban poverty. And one interesting example from Mumbai is how slum residents are relocated to these poorly ventilated high-rise buildings where it gets very hot and diseases like tuberculosis are easily spread. And this is because of a development model where slum upgrading in Mumbai is financed by the developer taking over the land that's left after rehabilitating the slum. So they profit maximize by building on the smallest possible surface possible. So our Indian colleagues were very critical of this phenomenon, and they call this type of social housing vertical slums. And this is another project that I'm part of that's parallel to my Resilient project, and it's about why do informal residents resist state adaptation, and how do their risk perception and legal consciousness, which is a sociological concept, it refers to their assumptions about legality and the law, shape how they resist adaptation. Okay, so finally we're here, and I got funding for 3 years for this postdoc project. I call it Where the Favela Meets the Forest, or Favela Adapt. And my idea is probably to keep looking at Assista, which I'm familiar with, but perhaps also other favelas in Rio. And kind of as a result of the understanding of adaptation that I presented here today, I want to study this from 3 different perspectives. So one is the community level, and in particular examples of EBA, which could be anything from residents building green roofs and community gardens to these large-scale initiatives like the municipality's 30-year-old Mutirão Florestamento, which has as its main purpose to reduce landslide risk. So in a way you could see it as a as a clear example of EBA and with favelas. And again, it's important to remember here that differently from the broader category of NBS, EBA is about responding to a climate-related hazard, like landslide, flooding, or heat, etc. But this component then is also about analyzing the structural causes of climate risk in the favela, or the progression of vulnerability that you saw here before, from the pressure and release model. And the second objective is to look at the city level and how EBA for favelas is integrated in urban planning and related to different urban planning models. And the third level is science, because urban EBA in and for the favelas, it needs knowledge from different scientific disciplines, which is why I'm interested in how the related science is produced, and if there is a collaboration or if there are epistemological conflict between these different disciplines. And these are as much my own interests as gaps in the literature. But I hope that in the end, this project can result in some principles or best practices for EBA in informal areas that could be useful both in Brazil and abroad. So I'm not going to go into detail in the research questions because I think that I've talked long enough. But there's also this part of human-nature connectedness or perception of nature, and that's actually where I've done a pilot study in Assista in 2018. And it was a study that I conducted in early 2018 together with a Swedish colleague who is an expert in the perception of nature and human-nature connectedness. And we conducted 3 focus group interviews with culturally diverse groups. So it was one group of artists, one group of evangelical Christians, and one group of environmental activists. And just to mention a few results from this pilot study, it's that nature perception in Rocinha is as diverse as its residents. And the group specifically mentioned how the different cultures in the community were seen as linked to the diversity of practices concerning nature. Like this quote here: a Rocinha é cheia de culturas diferentes, tem gente de Minas, Paraíba, Ceará, muitas pessoas que vieram de outros lugares trouxeram alguma coisa na bagagem. So, talking about the practices that they brought with them, agriculture. And as expected, people's view of nature in the favela was also very much related to degradation and lack of garbage management and disaster and even violence. But in parallel, a more positive image also emerged in these focus groups, where people talked about their small plantation of couve or medicinal herbs and how being in the forest gave them these feelings of well-being or freedom or spiritual experiences, or being cleansed or renovated. And here, this quote is an example of this. So it was a young man who said about going to the waterfall: eu gosto de ir porque me sinto bem quando estou lá, dou mergulho na cachoeira, fico ali pouquinho embaixo d'água, parece que eu converso com Deus diretamente, muito engraçado. Parece que quando eu saio da natureza, tudo que estava sentindo, dor no corpo, preocupação, tudo aquilo ali ficou e eu saio outra pessoa. Oops. Yeah, I have just one more slide. Now it's getting crazy. So I think that this is interesting. For instance, if you look at, it's interesting in itself, but it's also interesting for EDA. If you look at the types of adaptation measures that are being suggested in Rocinha, and there's, for instance, this new project that was announced not long ago, Comunidade Cidade. It's not articulated as an adaptation project, but it has plenty of adaptation measures, like this one here, that is about a sociocultural park that follows the natural way of the water through the community, and it's supposed to manage rainwater. And here in the plan, it also talks about different uses beyond the infrastructural function of water management. So what are these uses, and how would they correspond to the diverse ways that people currently perceive and use nature in the area? Yes. So that was actually the end. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and also thank you for my beautiful host institutions, EES and UFRJ. And I actually I prepared a few. Oh yeah, I also want to do a little bit of propaganda. If you think that these topics are very interesting, we actually have 3 different upcoming postdoc positions at my university, at my apartment in Lund, Sweden, with this lovely bunch of people. One worked together with me and our director, Emily Boyd, and Ana Maria Vargas in this project with Colombia and resistance adaptation. And then there's the sister project in Mozambique, also with Christine Ronster, who was my supervisor, who is also a big name in adaptation. And we have another project that's related also to the disproportionate impacts of climate extremes, also with Emily Boyd. So I don't think they've announced them yet, but keep an eye out at the homepage. And I also prepared some discussion questions, because now I'm kind of sick of talking and I want to hear from you. And so, of course, you can talk about different things, but something that I'm curious about is that which scientific disciplines are needed to construct adaptation planning for the favelas, and how do they interact here in Brazil? And do you think there are particular Brazilian conditions that defy the international literature on adaptation or informal settlements that I need to take into account, for instance, in my project? do you have like interesting examples of why people in the favelas are more vulnerable, or interesting solutions to adaptations in favelas? I would be very interested to know about that. Or interesting research on the topic. And I'll also be so rude as to just ask me to send me related research if you have anything that you think I must read. That would be very kind. So I think I will leave the word to the audience.
Well, first, thank you.